What do you think when you first saw this? You a basketball fan, NBA fan?
I don't watch a lot of basketball, to be honest.
There's no. Do they have a court at when you see opera? There's no sports whatsoever,
no.
are there?
No.
Right. Okay.
No. But
Not your cup of tea.
No. But when I saw this all go down, it really struck me how bad the Chinese are at propaganda. They're very bad propagandists. It's unbelievable.
They should be great.
They should be great at it because that's what they, in theory, that's what they do. But to have completely misunderstood the American public, to have elevated somebody who was not a household name to the degree that they did, they could have just suppressed discussion of this tweet within China, as they do with all things when it comes to their social media. They could have blacked it out, but to have said we're going to cancel games, we're not going to show it on TV, is to have created a situation which now means that if the American public didn't know what was happening, was there anybody left who didn't know what China was about and what was happening in Hong Kong? Now everybody knows.
It probably speaks to them feeling like they're backed into a corner to a certain extent.
In terms of Hong Kong?
No, in terms of pressure on the economy, wanting to make sure they crack down very harshly on U.S. companies, on anything headed into these trade deals.
I think you speak to another point that I would make about them is that it clearly demonstrates how insecure they feel. That they have to come down so hard on this suggests that they are concerned about their existence. Now, I am not saying that the fall of the Chinese regime is coming. A lot of people have predicted that, and it hasn't happened.
They're just a little touchy these days.
But they are extremely touchy, and you have to ask why. Do they fear for their existence? Do they fear about the economy? I bet they do, because it is weakening, regardless of the trade war.
Greg, what do you make of all these discussions we're having?
Well, the challenge facing multinational companies is that despite all the complexity, despite all the noise, China is one of the last remaining sources of pure consumer consumption growth. So CEOs around the world need to engage the market, and that creates the complexity that you start to see.
And, I mean, if you were the NBA right now, if you were Adam Silver, how would you approach this?
Well, I mean, the challenge that companies face is that they're starting to get increased pressure to have a voice on human rights, to have a voice on political issues, social issues.
As long as it's not China.
We've seen that. Well, that's where the NBA has kind of walked themselves into a discussion that probably isn't very helpful for them in the long term. But if you're going to have a brand, you need to stand for something, and that's clearly what Adam Silver's trying to do now.
Every company has walked into it, right? Every company that has said we're not going to do business in a certain state in the United States because they have passed this certain law. Now you have to turn to them and say, okay, so are you going to do business in a country that puts Muslims in concentration camps, right?
They're not going to go to the White House if they win the championship. They're not going to. I mean, have you read Steve Kerr and his comments on a deal, or Popovich? Do you see what they say about our own domestic situation?
Well, and that's
they're afraid. They're afraid to look askance at a communist party. I mean, look, that reeks of hypocrisy and being dictated by money, Greg. I think it's an awful precedent for PR.
Well, it goes back to, if you're going to do business in China, which every company now has to do, you have to have and develop a pretty proactive multi-layer strategy that involves not only figuring out how do you serve the Chinese consumer, how do you manage your supply chain, but then also how do you manage all of the overlay of political and social issues. You know, in the U.S., many of these companies have had experience with it. In Europe, they've had experience with it. China is a new adventure for many of these companies, and it shows the importance of needing to have that comprehensive strategy and manage it on an ongoing basis.
Well, I don't know, what kind of strategy can you have when
you got to choose sides?
You got to choose. Your consumer forces you to pick a side, right? That's the demand of consumers right now, particularly in America. And now the Chinese consumer appears to have demands based on the supposed outcry that was seen there. Which side do you choose? Because they're very different sides, right?
Well, and it goes back to one of the evaluations that we always ask clients is, how strong is your brand and what do you want it to stand for? Because if you are going to have a brand that has a voice, that voice is going to be challenged. Now, where you start to run into problems is when the consumers in one market and their preferences differ from the consumers in another market. Which fence do you, or which side of the fence do you fall on? Exactly. It's you know, multi-layered complexity when you talk about issues such as the ones we're talking about in Hong Kong and China.
You know, if you're woke, Greg, it shouldn't be controlled by who has where your financial interest is. You're either woke or you're not.
Well, what drives the financial interest in both markets may be different.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, South Park hit
right.
such a sensitive spot yesterday because they said we too believe more in money over democracy. I mean, that's what this comes down to. Are brands going to be forced to take a side? Are companies going to have to pick one side or the other?
Well, one of the elements that you see companies respond with is localization of many of those brands. So the brands can have different voices in different markets. Something like the NBA, however, is a global brand, a global powerhouse brand, and that puts them in the crosshairs.